My name is Dr. Wren Callahan. I'm 38 years old and I specialize in orthopedic rehabilitation. Some call it physical therapy. Others dismiss it entirely. My father used to call it fancy stretching with a degree. Today I'm standing behind a curtain at the annual board ceremony for the hospital where my father and brother have built their careers. Both surgeons, both men of scalpel and status. I'm here because one of my patients was invited to demonstrate her progress. She's 8 years old. Her name is Emily. I'm not listed in the program. No one even knows I'm the one who trained her legs to remember. As I peek through the side of the curtain, I see the stage lights bouncing off the polished floor. The auditorium is filled with white coats and expensive watches. The kind of crowd that claps for grant winners and applauds innovation, they'll never touch themselves. And then Emily rolls onto the stage. She's still so small. Her legs dangle from the chair like little vines wrapped in custom braces. The crowd is quiet, respectful, but doubtful. You can feel it in their posture, polite skepticism. She grips the sides of her chair. Her father whispers something to her. She nods. Slowly, deliberately, she pulls herself upright. Her knees shake. The room stills. She takes one step, then another, and a third. That's when the audience begins to lean forward. Not to applaud, to process. And then movement behind the rows. 8 men all in uniform, the deep green of the Marine Corps. They rise from their seats in perfect unison and walk to the front. No announcement, no fanfare, just formation. They stand shoulder to shoulder in front of the stage. Then they salute, not toward the child, but toward me. I freeze. Everyone turns to look behind the curtain, and I feel the heat on my face. My father, seated in the front row, doesn't turn around. He doesn't have to. He knows. He doesn't blink. His mouth parts just slightly. I hear his voice again, that voice, the one that used to dismiss everything I worked for. You're just a glorified nurse in uniform. But now 8 Marines are saluting me while a paralyzed child takes her first steps. And his face loses all color. He didn't know. He never knew. I was the reason they still walk. I didn't step out from behind the curtain to claim credit. I didn't wave or bow or smile. Instead, I stared at the rows of people, my colleagues, my father's friends, the very same hospital board that denied my credential reactivation. And I let them watch. Not because I needed the attention, because they needed the truth. I was never meant to be in this room. Not according to them. When I returned from deployment, I held the rank of lieutenant colonel and had treated over 400 soldiers with spinal trauma, many of whom regained motor function against medical expectation. My military file was clean. My outcomes were historic. But this hospital, my family's legacy, assigned me to the role of contracted mobility assistant. No title, no ID badge with doctor, no patient authority. Why? Because my father is Dr. Charles Callahan, head of orthopedic surgery, and my brother, Dr. Andrew Callahan, runs neurosurgical reconstruction. And me, I was the disappointment in combat boots. So when they stripped me of my autonomy, I didn't protest. I didn't sue. I let them bury me behind walls and forms and silence. Until Emily. Until the father who trusted me when no one else would. Until the day her legs moved again. And now here I am watching the same people who ignored me stare at the men I once carried out of the desert with nothing but gauze tape and sheer determination. 8 Marines who came here not for a ceremony, but for me. Because once long ago in the ruins of a field hospital in Kandahar, I told one of them, if you can curl your toes, your spine still remembers how to fight. They never forgot. My father rises slowly from his seat. He doesn't look at me. He only watches the men still saluting. Then he looks at Emily. She smiles at him only briefly, then turns back to the audience and raises her arm in a wave. My father sits down. He doesn't speak. Not yet. But I know what that silence means. It's not just shock. It's reckoning. I step forward now, not for applause, not for payback, but because every story has a beginning. And mine. It starts not with betrayal, but with belief. Belief in a girl who wasn't supposed to choose combat. Belief in muscles that were told they'd never respond. Belief that sometimes revenge doesn't roar. It walks, quietly, right across the stage. I was born into a house made of stainless steel. Not literally, of course, but if you opened our drawers, you'd find suture kits instead of silverware. My earliest memory is not of toys or cartoons. but of my father disinfecting his hands before dinner, muttering about bone density over roasted chicken. My mother used to joke that my first word wasn't mama, it was scalpel. My father, Dr. Charles Callahan, is a name that echoes through orthopedic circles nationwide. He rebuilt ACLs before most doctors could pronounce anterior cruciate ligament. Hospital wings bear his name. Patients send him thank you cards with their golf scores written in the margins. He walks like a man who has replaced hundreds of knees and wears the pride of it in every step. My brother Andrew followed seamlessly in his footsteps, only he went deeper. Neurosurgery, the brain and spine, the untouchable realm. He was always the star pupil, the one who didn't just memorize anatomy, but seemed to own it. His diplomas stretch across our hallway wall like a museum exhibit. When he got into Harvard Med, our father hosted a dinner party that felt more like a coronation. And me, I took a different path. I graduated from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, one of the few military medical schools in the country. While Andrew learned to cut open brains in clean ivory lecture halls, I studied trauma response under camouflage tents and humid desert winds. I learned medicine where blood didn't wait for permission to flow and healing had to happen fast sometimes, with only your hands and whatever was in your pocket. But I didn't go into surgery. I didn't wield scalpels like swords. I chose rehabilitation, physical therapy, spinal reconditioning, the art of teaching nerves to remember, coaxing muscles back to life. I chose to walk with patients after the operating table, to guide them through tremors and despair and small, impossible victories. In my family, that choice was unforgivable. My father once said, "A real doctor corrects. You're just a coach with a clipboard." My brother chuckled and asked if I'd start wearing gym shorts to work. They called what I did maintenance, as if rebuilding motion was somehow inferior to repairing bones, as if helping a soldier stand again was less honorable than fixing the break. It wasn't just professional snobbery. It was personal. They saw my decision as a rejection of tradition, of legacy, of the family name. So I stopped trying to explain it. At Thanksgiving, they'd talk about lumbar fusions and spinal laminectomies. I'd sip wine quietly, thinking of the young Marine who stood unassisted for the first time in 6 months because of balance drills I created on a concrete floor in a combat zone. When I received my commission as a military officer, they didn't attend the ceremony. When I finished my doctorate in neuromotor recovery, they sent a group text, "Congrats." And when I returned home after 3 deployments, they asked if I'd done enough yoga in Afghanistan. I told myself I didn't need their validation, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't burn. Because the truth is, I didn't want to be better than them. I didn't want medals or magazine spreads. I just wanted to matter in their world. But in a family of scalpels, being the one who holds the crutches makes you invisible. So I built my worth elsewhere. I earned the respect of the men and women who had been told they'd never walk again. I took on the cases surgeons passed over, the ones they said were hopeless. I found hope in nerve endings and hip flexors, in the twitch of a toe or the flex of a calf. But at home, at the dinner table, I was still the glorified nurse in uniform. So I stopped bringing up my work. I let them believe I was small. Let them believe I couldn't cut. Because what they didn't realize was this: I wasn't here to slice bodies open. I was here to rebuild what they couldn't. And one day, they'd see. After my final deployment, I returned home with 3 things: a duffel bag, a thick stack of military commendations, and a quiet plan to rebuild my civilian life. I'd seen enough battlefields to last a lifetime, and now I wanted to put my skills to work where they were needed. But this time, not in desert tents or abandoned schools, turned field hospitals. I wanted to work at Crestmore Medical Center, the prestigious hospital, where both my father and brother were practically royalty. My father was head of orthopedic surgery, my brother the star neurosurgeon with a research wing named after him. It was the very place where I once shadowed them as a teenager, where I dreamt of making a difference, not in the operating room, but in the quiet after, the space where healing truly began. I wasn't naive. I didn't expect open arms or red carpets, but I had hope for professional respect. I wasn't a rookie. I had a military medical degree, extensive trauma recovery experience, and a published doctoral thesis on nerve regeneration in spinal cord patients. My track record wasn't just solid, it was decorated. Still, when I walked through the glass doors of Crestmore with my application in hand, I saw the first flicker of disapproval in my father's eyes. He said nothing at first, just took my file, and promised to pass it along to HR. 2 weeks later, I received the offer letter contract nurse, temporary non-physician role, strictly limited to bedside support and observation. I read the title 3 times. Not rehabilitation physician, not neuromotor specialist, not even physical therapist. Contract nurse. No access to patient charts, no treatment planning, no diagnostic authority. Just shift work changing sheets, checking vitals, walking trays from the cafeteria to room 214. I called HR. They confirmed the position. I asked about the credentials they had on file. "Oh yes," the woman replied politely. "We're aware of your background, Dr. Callahan. The placement came after internal advisement. I didn't need to ask who advised them. It was no accident, no oversight. My father and brother had pulled the strings. I could picture the conversation perfectly. She's been out of touch with clinical practice. Her experience isn't aligned with hospital standards. She's more suited for patient support, not medical leadership." And just like that, I was demoted without ceremony. At first, I wanted to scream, to fight, to pull out my service record and lay it on the boardroom table. Show them the photos, the logs, the letters from Marines who walked again because of me. But I didn't. I accepted the position. I put on the Navy scrubs. No white coat, no nameplate on the door. Just a badge with my name and a laminated label, nursing support, temp. For weeks, I pushed carts down hallways. I used to roam as a child, watching my father command surgical teams like a general. I carried ice chips to patients whose rehab protocols I could have written in my sleep. I watched interns mess up post-op positioning, while the attending physicians ignored it and I wasn't allowed to say a word. I swallowed it all. The condescension, the sideways glances, the way other doctors would raise their eyebrows when they saw my name. "You're his daughter." What happened? Even my brother avoided eye contact in the elevators. They thought they'd broken me. But I was doing what I had always done best. Observing, I watched every mistake, every shortcut, every time a patient's progress stalled because they didn't have the right recovery plan. I kept notes quietly, meticulously. I saw patients decline under protocols that hadn't changed in 20 years. I saw young doctors treating bodies, not people, and I waited. Not out of pettiness, but because I knew something they didn't. Healing doesn't always come from cutting deeper. Sometimes it comes from seeing further. And I was going to show them, not with noise, not with arguments, but with results. 10 years ago, I was stationed near Kandahar, attached to a mobile field surgical team embedded with the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. The heat was merciless, the dust unforgiving. Every day the helicopters dropped off another body, sometimes still alive, sometimes not. Most arrived torn open by IEDs or gunfire. Spinal trauma was my specialty, and out here it was everywhere. That week we received 9 casualties from a convoy ambush. 5 of them had spinal injuries. 3 were already paralyzed. One was something else entirely. He was brought in unconscious, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Cervical collar in place, IVs dangling. His uniform had been cut away. His face was nearly gone, wrapped in sterile gauze, only his eyes barely visible beneath the swelling. He was labeled only by a number and blood type O negative. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. And for a while, I wasn't sure if he could hear, but I treated him like I did everyone else, like recovery was not just possible, but expected. For 3 weeks, I stayed by his side. I monitored every vitals fluctuation. I rotated his limbs, applied nerve stimulation, performed passive movement therapy, and whispered commands as if he could respond. 2 fingers, try to move them, that's it. Just 2. No response, but I kept trying. Every morning, I'd check his chart, and every night I wrote notes documenting microscopic changes: blood pressure, stabilization, reflex response, the tiniest twitch in his quadriceps on day 11 that no one else noticed. But I did. One evening, while adjusting his posture, I looked up and saw one eye slightly flicker, a tiny signal, a plea to be noticed. I held his hand and said, "You're still in there, and I see you." His fingers twitched. It wasn't enough to prove recovery, but it was enough to keep fighting. The rest of the unit saw a vegetable. I saw a man buried under trauma waiting for a way out. His name was never spoken aloud, not to me anyway. Most of the soldiers had been stripped of personal identifiers for security reasons after the ambush. but the bond we formed, silent, fragile, and profound, was real. Then on the 22nd day, a call came from command. My mother had suffered a severe stroke. She was in critical condition back home. I was granted an emergency transfer and put on a military transport plane that night. Before I left, I went to see him one last time. I tightened the sling on his arm, cleaned the dried sweat from his forehead, and whispered, "If you ever get out of that bed, don't waste the second chance." I walked out before I let myself cry. I never found out what happened after that. In the chaos of redeployment transfers and eventually my mother's long decline, I lost track of my own war stories. I buried them. I never followed up on those 9 Marines. And to be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Because if none of them recovered, it meant I had failed. And if they had recovered without knowing it was me who helped them, it meant I had vanished from my own narrative. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. I carried that silence for a decade, wondering, hoping, trying to forget. Until all those years later, 8 men in uniform saluted me in a hospital auditorium. And I recognized the posture of one of them. It was the man with no name, the one with no face, the one I thought I'd never see again. I first saw them from across the waiting room, him standing like a statue, her curled into a wheelchair, her legs slack under a blanket, her eyes quiet but defiant. The intake form said her name was Emily Warner, age 7, paraplegia, secondary to spinal cord injury sustained in a car accident 11 months earlier. Her primary physician had referred her for a neuromuscular consultation, but I already knew this wasn't just a routine checkup. No one fills out that much paperwork for something routine. The father's name caught my eye too, Mark Warner. A name as composed as the man himself. He wore a plain suit jacket, clean but worn, and stood with a kind of military stillness I knew too well. Everything about him, from the crease in his trousers to the way he scanned the room, said discipline and sadness. I walked into the exam room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Warner, Emily." I offered a smile. He nodded once. No smile in return? Emily didn't speak. She just looked at me, half curious, half exhausted. I knelt down and met her at eye level. "Hi, Emily. I'm Dr. Callahan. You can call me Wren if you want. I'm here to help you figure out what your body's still capable of." "Okay." Her eyes flicked to her father, then back to me. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. We began the exam. I tested her reflexes, checked tone in her limbs, and observed the lack of motor control below T10. She flinched at one point, not from pain, but from vulnerability. I paused. "You're safe here," I said gently. "We're just learning what your body's saying." Afterward, I turned to Mark. "She's physically stable. No spasticity, no contractures forming yet. That's good. But we're running out of time to activate certain neural pathways. If we want to try intensive functional rehab, we need to start now." He stayed quiet. "I'd like to use mechanical reflex therapy. It stimulates the spinal reflex arc's non-invasive safe, and sometimes we see surprising results, even this far post-injury." He crossed his arms. "She's been through a lot," he said. His voice was low, controlled. "We've tried a dozen things. Each time we hoped, and each time it didn't work." I nodded. "Hope can be cruel. But sometimes it's also all we have left." He looked at his daughter. She was picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. I added, "I won't make any promises, just possibilities." Mark looked at me with a kind of quiet skepticism. But behind his steady gaze, I saw the question he hadn't said out loud. What if this one's different? He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Instead, he stood up and said, "We'll think about it." He wheeled Emily out of the room himself. Most parents let the nurses do it, not Mark. He held the handles firmly, maneuvering the chair with practiced ease. As they left, Emily looked back. For a fraction of a second, her gaze met mine again, and in it was something that made my heart ache. Not desperation, not fear. It was the look of a child who wanted to believe someone still had a plan for her. That night, I reviewed her scans again, studied every vertebral shadow, every preserved tract of cord tissue, every potential window of function. I didn't sleep. There was something there. I could feel it. Not just in her spine, but in her story. And maybe, just maybe, mine too. On the third morning, just as I was wiping down the parallel bars and prepping the treatment room, I heard the wheels before I saw them. Emily's wheelchair entered first, then Mark followed. He nodded at me, just once, but it meant everything. "We're ready to try," he said simply. No grand speech, no questions. Just trust offered quietly, but firmly. I smiled. "Good. Let's begin." I introduced Emily to something I called the sensory wake-up protocol. Not glamorous, not high-tech. But it had depth. I placed a heated rice sock on her lower legs, warmth weight pressure reintroducing her body to sensations she hadn't consciously registered in nearly a year. Her eyebrows lifted. "That's weird," she whispered. "That's your brain noticing your legs again," I replied. I rolled a tennis ball under her feet, lightly tapping the arches, pressing into the metatarsals. She looked away at first. Then slowly her eyes followed my hands. Every movement designed to trigger somatosensory memory. I moved on to cross-patterning. Light resistance bands, gentle rotations of her knees and hips. Her legs flopped like soft clay at first, but that was expected. "This isn't about strength yet," I explained. "It's about reminding your nervous system it has a job." Emily didn't say much, but her shoulders relaxed by the 10th minute. Mark stood in the corner, arms folded, watching, not interfering, not judging, just present. That was rare. Most parents either hovered or detached. He did neither. He was with her. At the end of the hour, Emily looked up at me with a strange expression. Not hope, not disappointment. Something softer, like calm. "Do we come back tomorrow?" she asked. I nodded. "We'll build this one day at a time." As they left, she waved at me. It was small, but after months of withdrawal, that wave felt monumental. Mark didn't speak, but as he turned to wheel her out, he gave me a glance, and in it I saw something new: belief. On day 6 of Emily's therapy, the storm hit. I should have sensed it coming, the way the admin staff avoided eye contact that morning. The fact that the schedule board was mysteriously wiped clean by noon. At 1:07 p.m., just as Emily was focused on a grip exercise, squeezing my hand, while I applied pressure to the back of her forearm, the door slammed open. My father entered first. Dr. Harold Callahan, starched coat, eyes like a scalpel. My brother followed. Michael Callahan, neurosurgeon, ego surgically enhanced over years of awards and applause. "Wren," my father snapped. "A word." I stood, shielding Emily instinctively. "We're in session," I replied. "Session," Michael scoffed. "You're not authorized to run sessions. You're not even a physician here." I saw Mark tense in the corner, but he said nothing. He let the scene unfold. Emily looked up, confused, anxious, her hand still in mine. My father stepped forward, addressing Mark directly. "Mr. Warner, you've been misled. This woman is not permitted to provide clinical treatment. She is a contracted physical therapy assistant. If you continue allowing her to touch your daughter, you risk permanent damage." Mark's face didn't flinch. He looked at me. I stayed calm. "Mr. Warner," I said evenly, "would you like me to step out and let you speak with them privately?" Emily gripped my hand tighter. "No," Mark said. "Just that one word." My brother laughed bitterly. "You're making a mistake." Then my father's voice dropped into that cold register I knew too well. "You think wearing fatigues makes you someone, Wren. You were always the soft one. You picked rehab because you couldn't handle a scalpel." He turned to Emily again. "This isn't medicine, it's theater." Emily's eyes welled up. But she didn't cry, she spoke. "Then why does it feel better when she helps me?" It stunned the room. Silence. Michael looked away first. My father clenched his jaw. Mark stepped forward finally. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said. "For harassment, for attempting to interfere in my daughter's treatment, and for professional misconduct." He turned to me. "Please continue." My father opened his mouth, closed it again, then stormed out. Michael followed, seething. I exhaled slowly. Emily looked shaken, but she squeezed my hand one more time. She didn't let go until the end of the session. By the end of the second week, my confidence began to fracture. Emily wasn't responding. No plantar flexion, no involuntary twitch, no curl of the toes, no hint of progress, not even the placebo kind where a patient wants something so badly they fake movement. Their brain forgets isn't real. Emily didn't pretend. She tried. God, she tried. Her eyes never left mine during sessions, but her legs remained mute, silent. A wall with no doors. Each day ended the same. I would help her back into her chair, she would whisper thanks, and Mark would wheel her out, polite, reserved, supportive but quiet. On day 15, I stayed late. The rehab wing emptied out. The lights dimmed to their eco-saving glow. I sat alone at the therapy table, staring at the crumpled treatment plan I'd rewritten 5 times that week. Then I opened my old field notebook, the one I hadn't touched since the Kandahar deployment. The pages still smelled faintly of sand and antiseptic. My handwriting was jagged from adrenaline, the ink blurred in places where blood or sweat or maybe tears had smeared it. Halfway through the journal, I found a page dated March 2013. Man with no face, T6 fracture, no family contact. Unresponsive below the chest. Helmet ID destroyed. Only partial dog tag recovered. I stared at the words, my own shorthand. I could remember the cot he lay on, the raw skin on his arms, the way his bandages had to be changed every 3 hours because of the oozing, the way I'd talk to him anyway even though he never replied. Massage stimulation limited. Response test negative. But increased REM during therapy sessions. I had written that. I had seen something. Then I stopped flipping. The last line of that entry caught my breath. Started humming to him. Mozart. He breathed easier. I closed the book slowly. What had happened to him, the man with no name, no face, no voice? Was he buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Nevada? Did he ever walk again, or did he die before he got the chance I'd never known? I was recalled after 3 weeks when my mother collapsed back home. By the time I returned stateside, I was transferred. That unit had moved. No names were ever attached to the patients I treated in that stretched tent under enemy shelling. But somehow I remembered that man, more than any other. And I remembered the desperation I felt kneeling beside his cot, willing his neurons to fire, begging his spine to reconnect, if not for life, then at least for dignity. That same desperation now curled around me in this hospital. Was I doing this all over again? Pouring my soul into a lost cause, I looked at the mirror in the therapy room. My reflection was tired, my bun half loose. Scrubs wrinkled from kneeling beside Emily's legs. There was rice flour on my collarbone from the warm packs. And yet I looked more alive than I had in years. Because I wasn't fighting for glory. I never had been. I was fighting for something smaller, quieter, like a breath, a twitch, a whisper. Still doubt gnawed at me. Was I wrong to think Emily could recover? Had I seen too many miracles on the battlefield that I started mistaking faith for medicine? I closed the notebook, placed it on the table, and stared out the dark window. There was no moon, just hospital floodlights bouncing off parked cars. I pressed my palms together and leaned my forehead into them. You are not God, I whispered to myself. But you're not useless either. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring me back the next day, and the day after that. By the 3rd week, I had stopped watching the clock during sessions with Emily. We had entered a quiet rhythm, no miracles, no breakthroughs, just the slow intimacy of hope, stitched in silence. She was still paralyzed from the waist down, no movement. But her face no longer held that tightness of fear. Her shoulders weren't as tense. And sometimes when I applied the heat packs to her calves, she closed her eyes as if she could sense something. Maybe it was phantom memory. Maybe it was my desperation leaking into the room. That morning, the rain fell like thread across the therapy room windows. Everything outside was dull gray, and I could feel the drop in barometric pressure in my knees. Emily was laid out on the therapy table, her head turned slightly toward me, her hands folded over her stomach. She had stopped asking, "Is it working?" a week ago. I picked up a soft rubber ball and placed it in her left hand. "This one's just to distract you," I said gently. She smiled faintly. "You're not good at lying." I laughed under my breath. "Lucky for you, I'm not lying." Then I knelt near her bare feet, gently positioning her legs in a neutral position. I tapped a tendon on her ankle with the back of my pen cap. No response. I lifted her right foot slightly, cradling the heel in my palm. Then I said it softly without ceremony. A line I hadn't used in 10 years. If you can curl your toes without looking, your spine is still listening. There was silence. I didn't even realize Mark was still in the room. He had been sitting in the corner flipping through some paperwork. The kind of military-looking folder I assumed was filled with benefit documents or therapy authorizations. I thought he wasn't paying attention, but he froze. His head snapped up slowly. His eyes met mine across the room, and something flickered. It wasn't confusion. It was deeper than that. Recognition buried in disbelief. He didn't say a word, didn't frown, didn't smile, didn't interrupt. But his entire body changed. His shoulders stiffened as if someone had grabbed him from behind. His fingers curled around the folder, like it had suddenly become heavy. And he just stood. Not abruptly, not rudely, just decisively. He walked to Emily, gently laid his hand on her head, and kissed her temple. Then he looked at me again. I held my breath, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded once and walked out of the room. Not a word, not a single sentence, but the look he gave me lingered like a note unresolved. I didn't understand it at first. I went back to Emily's feet, adjusted her posture, ran the brush test on her arches. She didn't flinch. Still nothing. But I kept thinking about Mark. The way his jaw had clenched. The way his eyes had widened just slightly as I said those words. That phrase. That exact line. If you can curl your toes without looking, your spine is still listening. I had only ever said it aloud once before, in a different time, in a different place, to a man with no name, no face. Kandahar, 2013. A chill ran through me, not fear, but memory. Suddenly, the gap between past and present felt razor thin. The rain tapped louder against the window. Emily stirred on the table, murmuring, "Did I do something?" "No, sweetheart," I said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not yet, but we're close." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself to wonder who was Mark, and what exactly had he remembered. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He went home not to rest, but to remember. In the quiet of his study, he pulled out a weathered green notebook from a locked drawer. It was bound with a fraying elastic strap, the pages yellowed with time and sand. Across the top of the first page in bold black ink, it read, "Forward Operating Base, Kandahar, 2013. He thumbed through the entries, flipping past maps, call signs, coordinates. Then about halfway in, he stopped. There in meticulous block print was a brief note written by his own hand, Dr. L. Female. Calm tone. Hands didn't shake. Treated all 9 of us. No rank insignia. Week 3, she disappeared. Everyone walked after week 6, except me. I stood at week 7. Then she was gone. No name, no photo, no confirmation. Just that. He stared at the note for a long time. The words on the page blurred into the memories in his head. He remembered the pain, the deep, paralyzing kind that made a man want to die. He remembered the voice that said, "Breathe through the pain. That means your nerves are listening." He remembered the warmth of her hands as she tested reflexes and the soft encouragement in her voice when others gave up. And he remembered that one day she was gone. No goodbye, no announcement, just gone. He leaned back in his chair and whispered aloud, "You were her." The next morning, he reached out to the only men who would know for sure. The 8 others. They were scattered now, 2 retired, 1 working for a VA clinic in Texas, another running a ranch in Idaho. But he found them, called them, one by one. Some didn't answer at first. Others needed reminding of old codes and old wounds. But when he asked the question, "Do you remember the woman who helped us walk again?" he got only one answer. "She changed my life." That was from Sanchez, the youngest of them all, the one who nearly lost both legs. Mark closed his eyes. There was no doubt. Wren Callahan, the woman standing in that sterile room, teaching his daughter to listen to her spine again, had once dragged him quite literally back to life. But it wasn't just gratitude that filled him. It was awe. It was clarity. It was the realization that while he had spent years forgetting the woman behind the bandages and face mask, she had never once stopped healing people, even when the world shoved her into the shadows. That night, Mark didn't call me. He didn't show up at my apartment. He didn't send an email or knock on my door. He just circled the date on his calendar. Day 30, the day he knew his daughter would rise, and the day he would finally stand tall too. The morning air felt sharp like glass. We had moved therapy outside today, Emily insisted. She wanted to feel the earth under her shoes again. Mark stood off to the side, wrapped in a gray wool coat, hands tucked in his pockets. He hadn't said much all morning, but there was a calm steadiness in him, a kind of quiet reverence. Emily sat in the wheelchair-gloved hands, resting on the wheels, breath visible in the crisp dawn. I knelt in front of her, adjusted the straps on her support braces, and gave her a small nod. Just stand. That's all. 1 second if you can. She took a breath, then another, and then slowly, inch by inch, she began to rise. Her arms trembled as she pushed against the armrests. Her face flushed with effort. Her brow furrowed in defiance. 5 seconds. Her knees wobbled, but she was up. 10 seconds. Her eyes met mine. I smiled for the first time in 3 years. Not the polite automatic smile I'd worn like a mask. A real smile. One that tugged at the scars beneath my ribs and cracked open the weight I'd been carrying since Kandahar. Mark stepped closer but didn't interfere. He let her have the moment. When Emily finally sat back down, breathless cheeks wet with frozen tears, he placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something only she could hear. Then he turned to me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't explain what I already knew he now understood. He just looked me in the eye and said quietly, "She remembered." And so did I. And somehow, that was more than enough. The hospital's annual rehabilitation conference was only 2 weeks away. It was the most public event of the year, a chance for the heads of departments to present groundbreaking treatments and for patients to showcase miraculous recoveries. I had attended it every year, always standing at the back, always in the shadow of my father and brother, always silent. But this year was different. On the 34th day of Emily's therapy, Mark asked to speak with the event committee. He didn't come with arrogance or entitlement. He came with clarity, purpose. He stood before the panel, my father included, and said I would like my daughter to walk at this year's ceremony. My father didn't even let him finish before scoffing aloud. With all due respect, Mr. Alden, this is a clinical demonstration, not a personal stage. We don't offer sentimental exceptions. Mark looked at him without blinking. Let her walk. You'll know what's real. Another committee member leaned forward. Are you proposing this as proof of a specific technique? Mark hesitated. I'm proposing this as proof of a healer. Silence. Then my brother chimed in. Who's the attending physician? Mark paused. Wren Callahan. That's when the atmosphere shifted. I wasn't in the room, but word spread like it always does in hospitals, with whispers down corridors and polite warnings passed through nurse stations. They said my father stood up and declared, "She is not authorized to treat patients. What she's done is a breach." Mark, according to the orderly who overheard, calmly replied, "Then maybe your policy's the real breach." I was summoned the next morning. I expected a formal reprimand. Instead, I found a printed schedule on my locker door. My name was added to the lineup of presentations, Therapeutic Reflex and Tactile Reconnection Emily Alden Case Study. Demonstration by patient. No explanation, no apology, just that. But I knew Mark had pushed, and I knew he wasn't done. 3 days before the ceremony, I noticed Mark missing our usual afternoon recap. I figured he was helping Emily with mental preparation or finalizing her outfit. But what I didn't know was that Mark had set something far greater in motion. He had spent the last week tracking down the remaining 8 soldiers from Kandahar. He didn't know all their names, but he had fragments, nicknames, partial call signs, old notes in a battered notebook, and he used them like breadcrumbs. Through military alumni groups, encrypted forums, and even a retired VA clerk in North Carolina, he pieced together the last known locations of the men I had once treated. Some were hard to reach. One was living off-grid in Oregon, another in a cabin in Maine with no phone. But Mark was persistent. When a man owes someone his legs, he makes the effort. He never showed them my photo because there were none. Back then, I'd always worn surgical masks and kept my distance. But when he asked, "Do you remember the woman who treated us?" they all said yes. She never wanted credit, one man replied. She just wanted results. Another added, "She used to say, 'If it hurts, it means you're healing.' I've said that to my own son." One by one, they agreed to come. Mark didn't tell me. He wanted it to be right. wanted the moment to speak for itself. The morning of the ceremony, I found a quiet corner backstage with Emily. She was radiant hair in a neat braid, cheeks flushed with nervous energy. Her braces were hidden beneath black slacks. Her white blouse had a red thread stitched inside the collar. Courage is a muscle she had embroidered herself. Mark hadn't arrived yet, but I figured he was simply delayed. I had no idea what he was bringing with him. The auditorium was packed. White coats, black ties, shining name badges. All eyes on the polished stage. A banner read, "Annual Advancements in Neuromuscular Rehabilitation." I stood to the side, watching from the shadows as always, until they called her name. Emily Alden, patient of therapeutic reflex reconnection. Demonstration by patient. She wheeled herself out. Alone at first, then slowly she stood. The audience stiffened. A few leaned forward. One woman in the front row covered her mouth. Emily took one step, then another, 5 steps, 10 steps, and she stopped in the center of the stage. Balanced, proud. The applause started softly, then grew. But before it reached its peak, a murmur rippled through the crowd. 8 men were walking down the center aisle, each in dress uniform, quiet, purposeful, their formation perfect. The room fell silent. When they reached the edge of the stage, they turned to face me. I froze. They raised their hands in perfect unison and saluted. The air in the room cracked. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then one of them, a tall man with silver at his temples, stepped forward and said loud and clear, "We walk because of her, so does she." Gasps, audible ones. All around me, chairs creaked. Someone dropped a clipboard. My father, seated 3 rows from the front, didn't blink. His face had gone ghost white. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. I wanted to say something, anything, but for the first time I realized I didn't have to, because the truth had spoken itself, because Emily had walked, and because those 8 men had stood, and because I, finally, was seen. The applause hadn't even finished echoing when the pushback began. At first it was subtle, a few tight-lipped smiles, a couple of doctors nodding politely, then quickly diverting their eyes. My brother disappeared backstage, avoiding me entirely. My father left early, saying nothing, but I knew the storm was coming. By the next morning, the hospital board had already scheduled a special internal review. The email subject line read, "Discussion on Professional Boundaries and Unauthorized Procedures." I was not surprised. In the conference room, they sat across from me like a tribunal. Polished shoes, folded arms, controlled tones. My father didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence had always carried more weight than his words. The head of the board opened with a practiced sigh. "Wren, while we acknowledge some extraordinary elements of what happened yesterday, we're deeply concerned about the precedent this sets." Another added, "You administered treatment to a minor patient without formal clearance, under a therapy not yet peer-reviewed or approved by the attending physician. They didn't ask me how Emily was doing. They didn't ask what it felt like to see her take 10 full steps after months of immobility. Instead, they asked about protocol, about paperwork, about oversight. I did what no one else was willing to try," I replied, "with the full consent of her father." "Yes," a woman said sharply, "but not the consent of this institution." The word institution stung more than it should have. As if healing had to pass through Gates' signatures and boards before it was considered legitimate. That afternoon, the gossip began spreading through the hospital corridors like wildfire. Some colleagues I'd known for a decade passed me without a glance. One even whispered, "She just embarrassed the entire rehab department." Another doctor scoffed as I entered the staff lounge and muttered, "Now we're all YouTube therapists, apparently." But outside those walls, something different was happening. The clip of Emily walking had been recorded by a visiting parent, someone whose child was undergoing physical therapy in another ward. They had posted it on social media with the caption, "She walked," because someone believed she could. Within hours, the video had exploded. Tens of thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands. Then news outlets began calling. I stayed offline for most of the day, but Mark came to my office in the evening, phone in hand, and said, "You need to see this." He showed me a trending hashtag. "Let them walk again." It had started as a simple phrase beneath the video, but now it was everywhere. Patients from around the world were commenting, sharing stories of stalled recovery, rigid systems, and therapists who gave up too soon. One user wrote, "I was told I'd never walk again. I wish I'd had a Wren." Another posted, "Give these healers the room to work." The spine listens when compassion speaks. And then came the letters, emails from parents, veterans, schools, even international rehab centers, asking if the method had a name, asking if I would speak at conferences, asking for hope. The board still hadn't decided what to do with me. My father still hadn't looked me in the eye. But for the first time in years, my inbox wasn't filled with complaints or protocol memos. It was filled with gratitude, and I knew. The conversation had shifted, not because I spoke, but because Emily walked. He waited until the hallway was nearly empty. The ceremony was over. The clapping had died down. The board had returned to their guarded offices, and the media had packed up their cameras and questions. My brother was nowhere to be seen. Emily had gone home, leaning slightly into Mark's side, but walking entirely on her own. For the first time in a decade, the hospital lobby felt still. I was about to turn toward the staff wing when I heard his voice. "Wren." It was steady. No emotion, no hesitation. Just my name, said like he used to say it when calling roll in class, neutral, professional, detached. I turned slowly. He stood there in his lab coat, the very same one I had seen him wear since I was a child. It looked more like armor now. He held a clipboard empty, just something to hold maybe, something to protect himself with. We stared at each other for a long moment. He spoke first. "Why didn't you say anything?" It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't apologetic either. It was genuine curiosity. As if somewhere behind his stern posture and neatly combed hair, he had just realized he had never actually asked me that before. I took a breath. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. This moment, more than any confrontation, deserved clarity. "Because I didn't need you to believe me," I said. "I only needed others to walk again." He didn't respond right away. He looked down, then up, studying my face like I was a clinical puzzle that suddenly didn't match his chart. "You could have fought harder," he finally said. "I did. Just not in rooms where I wasn't heard." His jaw tightened. A familiar expression, the one he used when a student gave an unexpected answer. "Not wrong, just inconvenient." "I wasn't trying to keep you down," he said after a pause. I nodded. "I know. You were trying to protect the name, the institution, the reputation. You just forgot to protect me." That landed. He glanced away. His shoulders shifted slightly as if he was adjusting some invisible weight. For a man who built his life around diagnostics, I saw it then how unprepared he was to read his own daughter. "I saw her walk," he said finally. "I know. It was real. It always was." He looked up again, and for a second, just a flicker, I saw the father I remembered as a girl. The one who put a hand on my back when I first held a stethoscope. The one who said, "You have a mind like a surgeon. But don't forget your hands can heal too." He didn't say he was proud. He didn't say he was sorry, but he said one thing. And for him it was everything. "You're still not on the official board of physicians." I smiled. "Then I guess it's time they updated the list." He let out a breath. Almost a chuckle. Almost. And then he walked away, silent, composed, but slower than usual. No clipboard to hide behind this time. Just a man realizing his daughter had done something he didn't teach her. She had made people believe again, without ever needing permission. It wasn't in a church or a grand hall. Mark and I chose the hospital's rehabilitation garden for our wedding. A place where hope had grown, where footsteps had returned, where silence had once meant despair, and now meant peace. The chairs were arranged in gentle rows, beneath the soft arch of blooming jasmine. Nothing extravagant, just enough to seat the few who mattered. Emily walked on her own. No crutch, no brace, no guiding hand. She wore a light blue dress, her hair pinned with white flowers, and each step she took down the aisle brought a quiet wave of emotion through the guests. Mark watched her with the kind of pride that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I stood at the opposite end of the aisle, not in a wedding gown, but in my white medical coat. It wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. That coat had seen war zones. It had seen failure, triumph, blood, silence, and now joy. It was my armor, my story, my vow. When I reached Mark, we didn't exchange long speeches. Our eyes carried years already. Loss, healing, recognition. I found you twice, he said softly. And I saved you both times, I replied with a smile. We both knew it wasn't just about Kandahar, or about Emily. It was about the quiet spaces between those two lives, how we had crossed paths before we ever had a name for each other. The minister was brief. That was our request. The vows were handwritten. Simple. I vow to listen when the world is loud, I said. To step back when you need space. And to walk beside you even if the whole world doubts the ground beneath our feet. Mark's voice was low, steady. I vow to remember who you were, even when you're too tired to remember it yourself. And to trust your silence even more than your words. Behind us in the front row sat 8 men. Veterans, survivors. They wore suits that didn't quite fit and posture that still remembered war. But their faces were soft today. Eyes that once stared through pain now shimmered with something else. Gratitude, respect. One of them wiped a tear as Emily sat beside him. My mother was there too. She sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, her white scarf tucked neatly around her shoulders. She hadn't spoken much since my father's final resignation. But today she smiled, not just for me, but for the girl I once was, and the woman I had become without asking for approval. When the ceremony ended, we didn't throw rice, no champagne fountains, just a small table with tea bread and Emily's favorite lemon tarts. People talked in low voices, laughed. No one mentioned the hospital board, or my brother, or titles. They just said my name and meant it. Wren, not doctor, not nurse, not the one who stirred controversy, just Wren. And in that moment, surrounded by Jasmine and veterans and a child who could walk again, I knew. This was the only ceremony I ever needed. The rest of the world could keep their judgments. I had already walked through fire. Now I walked forward with love, with peace, and a future that finally felt like mine. There was no ribbon cutting, no press release, no dignitaries in suits, no speeches from hospital boards or medical associations. Just an open door and a wooden sign carved by one of the men who once couldn't hold a chisel. The L Center. And beneath it, legacies that walk again. We didn't name it after me, or Mark, or Emily, or Kandahar. We didn't hang medals on the walls or line the entrance with framed newspaper articles. There was no wall of fame. There was only a wide hallway and light. Warm, natural light that poured through every window, touching every wheelchair, every pair of crutches, every mat, and every hand that reached out to help someone try again. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a clinic. It was a space for stories to restart. Mark and I built it with the help of the 8 veterans who had once saluted me in silence. They came not as war heroes, but as witnesses. As proof that what we dared to believe was possible. We started with 5 patients. One had survived a car crash. Another had cerebral palsy. One had been turned away from 3 hospitals. 2 were simply tired of being told to adjust. Here we didn't promise cures. We promised curiosity, commitment, and compassion without the need for applause. We taught by remembering how pressure on the heel might awaken a memory in the spine, how sound vibrations could help locate buried reflexes, how warm rice could do what cold instruments could not. Each wall was painted soft gray. Each room was named after something quiet, whisper, pulse, ember, thread. The L didn't stand for leg or life or legacy, not really. It stood for the unknown woman in the Kandahar tent who had no name, for the countless caregivers who gave everything and vanished without ceremony. It stood for listening, learning, leaping, and sometimes just simply love. People came and went. Some walked, some didn't, but all of them moved forward. We tracked no success rate. There were no charts outside doors, only footsteps, some slow, some steady, some trembling, that echoed softly through the halls. I never wore my white coat inside, just jeans and a linen shirt. I didn't want to be looked up to. I wanted to kneel, hold a patient's foot, and whisper the same line I once told a girl named Emily. If you can curl your toes without looking, your spine is still listening. At the L Center, we all learned how to listen again. And in that quiet, we moved. Together. It was late afternoon when I saw her. Emily. She stood in the far corner of the training room, wearing a soft blue t-shirt and a name badge that read, assistant coach. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her voice, so calm now, guided a little girl's trembling steps across the balance mat. The girl's name was Sophia. I'd met her 2 weeks earlier. 7 years old, she'd survived a spinal tumor surgery and hadn't taken a step since. Fear had rooted deep in her eyes. But here now she looked up at Emily with wonder. Not because Emily held answers, but because Emily never rushed the questions. "One step is enough," I heard Emily say gently. "You're not walking to impress anyone. You're walking to remember who you are." Sophia blinked, then nodded. And with Emily's hand loosely cupping hers, not gripping, not pulling, just present, Sophia moved forward, one foot, then the other. Her gait was uneven, wobbly, full of resistance. But it was hers. I didn't interrupt. I stayed seated at the edge of the hallway where sunlight spilled in from the west windows, warming the stone floor and casting long, quiet shadows. My notebook lay open on my lap, half filled with observations, to-do lists, and tiny sketches I never showed anyone. But that afternoon I didn't write, I just watched. Emily had grown, not just in strength or confidence, but in presence. That weightless kind of presence that didn't demand space, but filled it naturally. I remembered the first day she entered my room, rigid, terrified, skeptical. And now here she was, offering belief in the most sacred form, time. Her laughter rang out when Sophia stumbled and fell onto a mat. Not mocking, not apologetic, just warm. Sophia laughed too. It was then that I smiled softly inwardly. Not because a child had taken a step, but because a teacher had been born. I remembered the voices, the ones that had filled my ears for years. "You're not certified. You never finished your rotation. You don't belong in a hospital. You're risking your license. You're not even a real doctor." And then the worst one, "You're invisible." But not to Emily, not to the veterans who now returned yearly to volunteer, not to the families who waited in our halls, clutching hope like it might vanish, not to Mark, who never once asked for my credentials again after the ceremony. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the warmth of the afternoon hold me. There are professions I once wrote that keep people alive, but there are people who help others walk again, sometimes through flame, sometimes through shadow. And then there are people like Emily, not just survivors, but bearers of the torch. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.